Hello, I'm Diane Bennett and I'm going to show you how to use your Hague linker for assembling your knitwear and for decorative effects. The linker gives you a really top quality finish to your knitwear in a fraction of the time that it takes to hand sew. In fact, it is the finish used for the most expensive commercially made knitwear. You'll find that if you follow the techniques that I'm going to show you in this video, for example putting on your neckbands and doing cut and sew necklines and neckbands, that you can save even more time than just actually sewing your seams with the linker. Now the linker comes in two versions. There's an electric one and a hand one. We've chosen to use the electric one for the video because then you will be able to see more clearly and I haven't got to put my hand across in front of you to turn the handle. The techniques are exactly the same if you've got a hand-operated linker. Here is the linker. This is the point ring. The knitted fabric is pushed onto that before it's linked. That holds it in place and stops it stretching while you're joining your knitting. The garment is normally linked with the yarn that you've used to knit it. You can use textured yarns, for example hobby, and fluffy yarns for linking your knitted fabric together. You will find that some very heavily textured yarns won't link and you will need to use a smooth toning yarn to link those. If you have a chunky machine, then you will probably need to use a finer toning yarn to link your chunky garments together. The fabric is joined with a chain stitch seam, which looks like this. The seam has a chain on one side and on the other side a straight stitch. I've done this piece with a contrast yarn, but of course you would normally use a matching yarn to join your two pieces of fabric together. Before you start assembling a garment, always think about the order that you need to join your pieces. This is a fairly simple set-in sleeve jumper, and for this one you would join one shoulder, then link the neckband and then join the other shoulder. While you can still open out the two pieces of knitting, put in the sleeves. Then you have the two long seams to join, starting from the cuff, down to the armhole and then the side seam to the welt. Now that can be done in one complete piece. Put the first section onto the ring and link it, and then pull off the linked section and put on the remainder of the seam. If you've been knitting a raglan garment, join three of the raglan seams before you put the neckband on. Then join the remaining raglan seam and the long seams just like the one I've just shown you. To thread up the linker, put the cone of yarn over the yarn holder here. Then take the end of the yarn up and over the top yarn guide. On the back of the linker you'll find the tension discs. Thread the yarn between the tension discs. There's a nut here which controls the amount of tension on that yarn. Normally you leave it in the same position, but for linking neckbands you'll probably need to loosen it off about 2 turns, but do remember to tighten it up again afterwards. Next, the yarn goes through the 2 yarn guides at the front of the linker here. There and there. And finally, use the needle threader to thread the yarn through the channel like that and through the needle, making sure that you take the yarn from front to back as you thread it through the needle. To join two pieces of knitted fabric with closed edges, put the first piece onto the linker pins with the right side facing you. To get a neat seam, you need to push the fabric on as close to one stitch from the edge as you can manage. Now put the second piece on. This is more difficult because you can't see as easily how far from the edge you are. It takes a bit of practice, but you will get used to it. Before you start linking, check that you've got the same amount of fabric above the pins all the way along. If you've got a piece which you haven't put on properly, just pull it off and put it back on again correctly. Then you're ready to start linking. Move the point ring round so that it's close to the beginning of the knitting. Hold the end of the yarn and then start linking. Don't stop immediately you get chain stitches so that you can get the knitting off without them undoing. Remove the loop from the looper, pull some extra yarn through, and then you can remove the knitting from the linker. That extra piece of chain at the end should be run back to the end of. Now this bit's very important. If you've made a mistake, you can quite easily pull that seam out, but if you're happy with it, then you pull the end of the yarn through the loop to that seam, like that. If you've got two pieces of fabric with stripes or fair isle that needs matching, then you can do this perfectly. Put the first piece on evenly and without stretching it too much. Now, when you put the second piece on, you can see exactly which pins the stripe is on to match them up. So you put the second stripe onto the same pins as the first one. You can also save yourself a lot of time by sewing in the ends while you're linking. Take the ends and wrap them under and over 3 or 4 pins before you start linking. Do each one and then you're ready to start linking. Move the point ring round to the beginning of the fabric, hold the end of the yarn and link. Remove the fabric from the pins. Don't forget to secure the end. And then you can snip these ends with scissors, like that. Putting in a sleeve takes a little bit of care. You need to make sure that the sleeve and the armhole match perfectly. Here's the sleeve, and this is the body of the garment, back and front, with the shoulder seam here. Put the body onto the linker first, and make sure when you've knitted the sleeve that you've got a marker thread which is in the middle of the sleeve, so that you can match that up with the shoulder seam. Now, as you put the rest of the sleeve on, make sure that you match it up, keeping it as even as you can. If you've knitted a fuller sleeve so that it's larger than the armhole, then you can in fact gather that centre section up slightly so that you get the two to fit together perfectly. Once it's on the linker pins, then again you can start linking. Before I get to the marker, I take it out so that it doesn't get caught by the yarn, and there's an end there which I can wrap so that it's secured when I've finished. Remove it from the linker, not forgetting to secure the end. And that's the sleeve inserted into the body of the garment. You can save yourself a lot of time if you put open stitches onto the linker pins. This is not as easy as putting closed edges on, but it's well worth practicing. With a jumper like this, the shoulder seam was shaped using holding position, leaving open stitches which are joined on the linker. And the neckband has been linked instead of back stitching, and those were open stitches as well. Now think about this while you're actually doing the knitting, because you'll find it makes it a lot easier if you've actually put in some sewing thread as a marker. After you've completed the main part of your knitting, take a contrast sewing thread and thread it into the feeder on its own, not with the main yarn. Knit one row at a fairly loose tension with that sewing thread, and then knit your waste yarn. But before you start knitting the waste yarn, turn the tension down a little bit. Don't be mean with the waste yarn, don't just knit 2 or 3 rows, but knit a reasonable length piece of waste yarn so that you've got something to get hold of while you're trying to get those open stitches onto the linker pins. Now, to put it actually onto the linker, I'll take this bit slowly so that you can see, and you'll find to start with you will have to do it as slowly as this, but with practice it can be done much more quickly. Hold onto the waste yarn and pull it up, and at the same time with your other hand guide those open stitches onto the linker pins like that. You can see now how one stitch goes onto each of the points on the ring. Like that. Now, if you miss one of these stitches, of course you'll have a loose stitch running down when you've finished your neckband or your shoulder or whatever. So you must check very carefully before you start linking that you have caught every stitch. Have a look by pulling the waste yarn up and pulling down on the knitting, and make sure that there's a loop over the top of every linker pin before you actually start the linking. There are many different ways of knitting and attaching neckbands. You probably have your own personal favourite, and you shouldn't need to change it for assembly with the linker. This jumper has a favourite of mine. It's a very easy neckband to knit because it's joined onto the garment while you're actually knitting it. Shape the neckline using holding position and then knit 1 row stocking stitch. Transfer over to the rib. Now do check that you've used the correct rib to match the welt. Knit double the length of rib that you need because it's a double neckband, and then transfer over to knit 4 rows of stocking stitch, followed by 1 row sewing thread and waste yarn. If the plain side of the garment is the right side, transfer over to the front bed, that is the ribber, to knit these 4 rows. When you knit the back, you also attach the neckband in the same way. Then all you have to do is to take the 2 pieces off the machine, join the shoulder, and then you can link the neckband. Now before you start linking, check how many stitches you used for the total neckline and use that number of points to put the neckline onto, like that. The neckband sticks up above the linker. There's the rib, followed by the stocking stitch, so you fold that over forward and put the open stitches onto the linker pins. Now, before you start linking, check that you've got every stitch onto a pin. If not, remove that piece and put it back on again. When you're ready, link. But remember to loosen the tension nut on the back of the linker. As you take the neckband off, tighten that tension nut on the back of the linker. Don't forget to do that before you use it for ordinary linking. There's the completed neckband, and at this point you can still have another go. You can undo the linking and do it again if it's not right. So before you take the waste yarn out, which you can do quite easily by pulling on the sewing thread, check that each of the stitches has been caught while you were linking. You can use a similar method for a V-neck jumper. The problem with V-necks is matching the centre front. If you can knit the neckband in one complete piece, then you'll find that each end can be shaped in exactly the same way, and you can be sure that you'll get a perfect match. When it comes to linking it onto the garment, simply start at the centre front and link round to the centre back. Remove most of that and then link from centre back round to centre front, so that you've put your complete neckband on in one piece. Front bands can be attached to jackets and cardigans using the linker. There are actually two problems when you're putting front bands onto garments. One is to make sure that the band is put evenly onto the garment edge. Now, to try and do that as well as you can, put marker threads about every 50 rows into the band and also into the garment edge. Then you can match up carefully while you're putting the bands together. The other problem is that bands tend to fold back if they're not attached carefully. Now, there are two ways of attaching a band. One is to actually make a seam by putting the band and the garment edge together, and the other is to actually put the band on top of the garment edge so that you overlap them slightly. That gives you a much flatter finish when you've completed your band and helps to stop it flipping back. Now, here's a front that's been put onto the linker and a piece of band. Just like the neckband, you put the band above the linker pins and you overlap by pushing the edge of that band onto the linker pins as evenly as you can. And as you're linking, that will remain above the pins there. There are two ways of attaching the band. One is to put the garment on first, as I did there, and then the band on top of it. But if you've got an uneven edge to the band, put the band on first and the garment on top of it, so that you have the garment edge showing on the top of the knitting. Cut and sew. That's a phrase that strikes terror into the heart of a knitter. But it is so useful. If you've been doing a piece of rib or garter stitch or lace or any other stitch which is difficult to shape your neckline, then it's very much easier to do your neckline shaping using cut and sew. And you don't have to get your sewing machine out. You can use your linker. Now, the first thing that you have to remember is to mark the neckline while you're actually doing the knitting if you can. You can use a template afterwards, but really it's quite easy to mark the knitting while you're doing it and then tack around after you've finished. If you've been working on the single bed, then you can put in a series of marker threads like this, starting at the beginning of the neckline on either side and then a few threads at intervals as you knit up. Now, although that's easy on the single bed, unfortunately it's not as easy with the double bed machine. So when you're using the double bed machine, you'll find it easier to transfer stitches. When you reach the beginning of the neckline, transfer the stitches from the ribber to the main bed, or if it's a pass up, from the front bed to the back bed. Then you will have a piece of single bed fabric inside your double bed fabric, and you can see very clearly the outline of the piece that you've got to cut out. Once you've done your marking, the next stage is to make sure that you've got a nice line to follow. If you've done the ribbed piece, you'll find that that will probably be sufficient. But if you've done a single bed piece, then it's useful to follow that edge with a contrast coloured thread so that you can see very clearly exactly where you've got to put your line of linking. The line of linking is going to stabilise that edge so that it doesn't start to run. Now you can see that there's a problem because I can't stretch that piece of knitting open wide enough to get it onto the linker pins as it is. But this piece of knitting is going to be cut out in a minute, so to make it so that it will go onto the linker pins, simply get your scissors and cut down the centre to within about 1/2 inch of the bottom of the neckline. Don't be frightened. Now, following the line that you've tacked in there, put that onto the linker pins. I've got a nice bright thread there, so it's really easy to follow that line. And then I can do my chain stitch around it so that that secures the edge. Right, now we'll take it off and as usual secure the end. Now you probably think this is a sample, but it's not. This really is a jumper. It's knitted in lace and fine lace, so it took me quite a long time to knit, and I'm not going to waste it. So you can see I'm going to take the scissors to it, and it really is going to work. Just follow the line of that stitches with a nice sharp pair of scissors. And there's the shape of my neckline, ready to put the neckband onto it. Now, we need to sandwich that cut edge with a neckband. We need a piece of neckband at the back and at the front because we don't want the cut edge showing. First, knit the neckband separately from the garment. The easiest way is to hold up the garment edge to the machine and assess the number of stitches that you need. Then knit the band, and you've got to knit double the depth of rib that you require, because remember your garment's going to go in between the two, so it's got to be a doubled band. Finish with 4 rows of stocking stitch, 1 row sewing thread at a looser tension, and then the waist yarn at a slightly tighter tension, so that it will be easy to put the open stitches onto the linker pins. Now you put the neckband and the neckline onto the linker. This is actually the process which really stabilises that edge, and it ensures that you're not going to have any running stitches from that cut edge that you've just done. Now the first thing that you do is to work out how many stitches you used for your neckband, and you put the cast on edge of that neckband onto that number of linker pins. It's very important to make sure that you do that because you've got a certain number of open stitches and you've finished the sandwich with those, and if you haven't got the right number then you'll have to start all over again. Now here's the cut edge of my garment with the right side facing me, and that goes onto the linker pins next. Again, making sure that that matches up with the neckline. Now bring the open stitches forward and put 1 open stitch onto each linker pin, just like you did before. Make sure that the garment, neck and the neckband edge is pushed well onto the pins, because it's quite a thick sandwich that you're making here. keep pushing the stitches well back so that they don't get pulled off. When you've got it all sandwiched correctly, link the neckline. And there's your sandwich, no cut edge showing. Now to show you what it looks like when it's fully completed, here's a jumper with a neckline like that. You can see the cast on edge there, which has been put onto the linker pins first, then the cut edge, and finally the open stitches, which have been backstitched in that last stage of the process. You can use your linker not just for assembling your garments, but also for quite a wide variety of decorative effects. You can see one here. This top has been decorated with vertical stripes with the linker. The horizontal stripes are knitted in, so as you're knitting, you knit a lot of rows of black, 2 rows of silver, 6 rows of black, 2 rows of silver, and then repeat. But afterwards you add these vertical lines by putting that onto the linker. Now, if you don't mark the knitting, you would have great trouble getting those lines straight. So you've got to have some way of marking your fabric so that you can see where to get it onto the linker pins. The answer is fairly simple. If you want vertical lines like those, then you leave 1 or perhaps 2 needles in non-working position where you want your stripe for the whole of the knitting. If you're dealing with a fairly fine yarn, it's better to have 2 needles out of work, because you've got to be able to get this onto the linker pins without catching either edge, as that distorts the stripe. Now, for these stripes going across this way, if you want to add those afterwards rather than knit them in, as I did on the black and silver top, you can put a marker line in by doing a row at the loosest tension on your machine. So you just knit up, knit 1 row at the loosest tension, and then continue to the next marker line that you want. Here's a piece that's had the stripes knitted in, and the vertical stripes are going to be added on where the needles were left in non-working position. You usually put these pieces on with the wrong side facing you. Remember that when you're linking, you get the chain stitch on the side away from you and the straight stitch on the side towards you. Now the chain stitch is going to show much more clearly than the straight stitch, so we want that on the right side of the knitting. So I've put this on with the wrong side facing me. I'll just put the rest of that line onto the pins, but don't start linking yet. Now what you've got to do is to check very carefully that you haven't caught either edge of that stripe while you were actually putting that line onto the pins. Once you're happy that it's all right, you can start linking. and I can have two different coloured stripes, one going across my knitting and the other one going up and down. When you're doing this onto quite a wide piece of knitting, you will find that as you put the stripes on, you'll have to roll part of the garment over so that it will run through this part of the linker here, and link fairly slowly while you're doing that so that you can make sure that it doesn't get caught up. Shearing is another very attractive effect that you can achieve with the linker. You can shear vertical lines, horizontal lines, or even squares. This one has the shearing vertically, about every 12th stitch, the line of shearing up the knitting, and if we look on this side, you can see that that's achieved with an elastic thread. Now there are several sorts of elastic thread that you can use. Lycra or shearing elastic are probably the best. Thread the elastic up carefully. It is a bit temperamental, so you'll have to be very careful with it. You'll also need to check the tension so that it doesn't break, but equally that it isn't too loose. Put your knitting onto the linker pins, hold the end very carefully. Now you may be a bit disappointed when you take this off the linker because it doesn't appear to shear that much. The reason is that most of these elastic threads are much tighter when they've been washed for the first time. So wash before you decide that you've done it too loosely. In fact, the best thing to do is always to knit a sample first, shear it and make sure that you've got the right tension on the thread, and then you can use it for your garment. You can put a lot of things onto the surface of your knitting using the linker. Here's some thick chunky yarn which has been put onto the surface in stripes. First the knitting was pushed onto the linker pins with the right side facing, and then the thick yarn was wound under and over the pins, just like when you're winding the ends that you're going to cut off. You don't just have to use yarn, you can use braids, lace and trims. Here's a ribbon. This is quite a loosely woven ribbon which could be pushed onto the linker pins. Now you have to check carefully when you're trying to find these because lots of ribbons are far too tightly woven and won't go onto the pins. But there are also a lot of braids which are suitable for putting onto your linker. Here's a braid which has been used as an insertion. You can see the edge of it is quite loose, so it was pushed onto the linker quite easily. It was attached first onto one edge and then onto the other edge, and this particular piece here has been gathered up. So this could be used on the bottom of a little girl's dress or something like that. Very useful if you want to lengthen something, in fact. Here's a suitable braid. You can see that it pushes onto the pins quite easily. I've put the knitting on already, and remember this has to go onto the right side. Now you can link with yarn, as I'm about to do, but you can also link with sewing thread, which is useful for matching up the braid colour. there it is, along the edge of the knitting. You can even use elastic. There are some open forms of elastic. They're called shearing elastic, like the narrow ones, but these are wide ones. You can get them in the width that you need for waistbands, so you can actually link a waistband onto a knitted skirt as well. You can also use your linker for making hems. Hems on the edge of a garment or hems in the knitting. Now if you're working on the plain side of the knitting, it's quite easy to pick up the hem while you're knitting. But if you want hems on the purl side, and this is tuck stitch here, so the purl side is the right side for this particular fabric, then you can't pick them up on the machine, and they were actually linked after that piece was knitted. Again, you will need a line to follow on either side of the hem. So a loose row at that point will give you a line to see where to put your hem in. Although I've used some samples, for a lot of the techniques that I've shown you, I've used a jumper of my own. This was the one that I showed you, the cut and sew neckline, covered with the neckband on. Now, because I know that so many of you are terrified to try this technique, I want you to see that it is a real jumper and that the neckband isn't going to fall apart when it's worn. The jumper's not quite completed yet. The neckband's been put on, the shoulders have been joined, and both sleeves have been put in. But we still have to join that long seam from welt to cuff to complete the garment. I hope I've shown you some new ideas for using your linker, not just for assembling your garment seams, but for all the other things as well. Now, the new techniques will take you some time to master. The more you do it, the quicker it will become. So don't be put off by the fact that the first time you put your open stitches on for a neckband, it seems to take you a long time, because it will get quicker. And you will save yourself a tremendous amount of time if you can use all these techniques with your linker. It's a wonderful piece of equipment, so please do try to use it to the full.